Yeah, we
All right.
are recording.
So, just for the sake of the interview, can you give a brief introduction on who you are and what you do?
Yeah, my name is David Rovics. I'm a singer-songwriter from Portland, Oregon, and I write mostly about history and social movements and things that are happening in news and sort of topical, what they call topical or protest songs, depending on who's defining these things.
Just curious, are you a IWW red card holder?
I am indeed current dues paying member with the Olympia branch for some reason. I live in Portland, but I registered in Olympia, so I used to live in Olympia.
So you're basically just a modern version of Joe Hill.
I yeah, I mean, I'm doing the same kind of thing that Joe Hill was doing, but a lot less union organizing. I mean,
Yeah.
he was in a certain time at a certain place in time where the radical labor movement was massive, and if the radical labor movement were big now the way it was then, I believe I would be swimming in it. I mean, I'd love to be involved with that, but I get involved with movements that I can plug into that are actually happening now. Although my fantasy would be to be involved with a huge
Oh, me too.
IWW. Yeah.
I know that's the dream. So you, besides being a musician, you're also pretty big on history, and that's why many of your songs are about historical movements, historical people.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so, before you, when you first started your songwriting, would you say that Hill had an impact on you, an impact on how you write your songs?
Yeah. When I first, let's see, so I first heard about Joe Hill. Well, I mean, I guess I heard about him earlier, but I first really sort of heard about him in the sense of like really understanding his position in history when I first read about the industrial workers of the world. And that was when I first read Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States. That was when it came out, I believe, in 1981. I think I read it pretty soon after it came out, and that was the first time I had ever heard of the IWW. And and I remember that specifically because it just had a tremendous impact on me. I mean, the whole book was so well written and such a great sort of introduction to U.S. history. But the stuff about the IWW was just so exciting. It's like you can't really tell the history of the IWW without it being exciting, because it was just crazy how much was going on, right? And that was so. Then I started getting into songwriting, I guess, around the same time that I was reading that book. So, but probably, and which was then also around the same time that I also discovered, soon after reading that book, Utah Phillips, Utah Phillips, and his album, Utah Phillips tells the stories or sings the songs and tells the stories of the industrial workers of the world. Just fantastic album.
I know.
And then another one that I found, which was somehow in the same, if you were looking for that, if you find Utah Phillips stuff, you were likely to find other stuff like this album of a collection of Joe Hill songs that was put together, I think, by Flying Fish Records, maybe, or Rounder Records, one of those little folk labels. And it was also lots of his songs. So, but the thing is that the thing is about talking about Joe Hill or his songwriting or how they influence me is that it's really almost impossible to say, because the problem is that it comes like it's like the baby that's within the bathwater of not that any of it should be thrown out, but it is like the fish swimming in the sea. It's like the IWW. I mean, Joe Hill was just one of several prominent songwriters and popular educators and cartoonists who were involved with the IWW and published regularly in IWW publications. And so he was just part of this. You can't really, when you discover Joe Hill, unless you discovered Joe Hill only by hearing Joan Baez singing about him in Woodstock, and you didn't look further than that. Like, I knew about him because of that. Like, because I heard Woodstock, I saw the Woodstock movie and heard the Woodstock album when I was still probably 12 years old or something. So it's long before I ever sort of learned about the IWW. I knew who Joe Hill was just from that Joan Baez, rendition, which I, always loved, but knew nothing about him otherwise. But generally, when you hear about Joe Hill, it's going to come in the context of hearing about the IWW and hearing about other songwriters and other music that was happening, coming out of that movement. So, it's hard to say, but what I can say, for sure is that all the movement music of the time, whether it's Joe Hill, Ralph Chaplin, T-Bone Slim, Haywire, Mac McClintock, or a little later Woody Guthrie, all those radical songwriters of that period were hugely influential for me and a lot of other people. But I think you might have that same problem asking that question of a lot of other left-wing musicians. What is specifically the influence of Joe Hill? Like, how do you pick that apart from the influence of Ralph Chaplin?
So you're a Portland artist. You play mainly in Portland, Oregon, and
no, I live in Portland and I play mainly in Europe.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So since you live in Portland, how much would you say is the IWW's presence there, or just not in general left-wing activism? Because that's one of the hot spots in the country.
The IWW has a very long-standing presence in Portland. Joe Hill was registered in the Portland IWW, as was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, one of the leaders of the IWW, and also John Reed, another IWW member who wrote the book The 10 Days That Shook the World about the Russian Revolution. He was also a Portlander, and so the radical history of radical labor and especially the longshore workers and the conflict on the docks and that goes way back, and in the logging camps, organizing in the logging camps, and this was the capital of the logging industry of the Northwest. So that goes way back. And I mean, in recent months, I think people who've been paying a lot of attention to Portland have been hearing about the protests against police brutality and other protests. And people also have probably been hearing about the history of Oregon as a white homeland and as a institutionally racist state from the very beginning. And all of that is true. It's all real. It's all part of Portland. And the reason why the protests have been as intense as they have been here, I think, has a lot to do with a lot of different potential factors. And I would say actually one of them is the fact that Portland is the most rent-burdened city in the country. It is the most expensive place to live in the country relative to how much people make in terms of how much the slumlords are charging, like mine. But the city, so I mean, by some of my friends' informal estimates, among the people protesting downtown, probably half of them are housing insecure, which is not to detract in the least from their concern about police brutality or racism. But just to put it into context, I mean, you're not talking about people who are oftentimes taking time off from their busy work schedule to go protest. These are people, in many cases who are unemployed and housing insecure, So, I mean, but really, I think Portland being on the floor of these protests really has everything to do with the fact that it is contested ground. This is the whitest major city in the United States, and it has a history of fascists making their home here. And since the 1980s, with the rise of, I mean, somebody said the civil rights movement never really made it to Portland in the 60s. It never really made it to Oregon. And I don't know exactly if that's entirely accurate. I mean, it's maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but but point taken. There was never a major sort of black-led civil rights movement in Portland, because black people in Oregon are 2% of the population. And overwhelming majority of black people in Oregon live in Portland, and still it's still black people are a very small minority in Portland as well. But in the 80s, things started to pick up in Portland in terms of anti-racist activity. Anti-racist action was very active. I would say still overwhelmingly a white, youth, organization, but at least in some forms, racism started to become something that was really on the agenda, in Portland because of the prevalence of racist skinheads here in this town. And they were dominant on the streets, and that changed. And it changed because of conflict, physical conflict, and and by the 90s they were leaving. The racists were leaving town in terms of organized institutional sort of organized racists were leaving Portland because it was no longer friendly territory for them. But they're still here. They're still around. They just moved to the suburbs, or they moved to Idaho. They didn't go far away.
So you seem to be really enthusiastic about just the history and just trying to organize your city of Portland and try to just make it better with your activism. So would you say that some of your songs that you write are what's the intention behind some of the songs that you write?
I mean, definitely in terms of normally before the pandemic, I spend about half my time traveling and playing music, and I used to tour in the US a lot, and I would like to continue to be doing that, but I started only touring in Europe because that's the only way I could pay the bills because of the economics of being a musician these days. And but it's especially since the pandemic hit. I haven't left Oregon since March, and I haven't. Yeah, and I've barely left I've barely left Portland. I mean, the furthest road trip I've taken since March was to get away from the fires. All the smoke, and to do that, we drove 2 hours to the coast to a town called Astoria. So we just, I mean, this is the least traveling I've done in my entire adult life. And but that's been really cool to be rooted in a place, and I always try to be part of a place that I'm living in terms of writing about it and actively involved with protests and whatever else. But since last March, not leaving at all, it's been a new degree of rootedness, I guess you could say. And I've been trying to get involved not just with writing about what's happening and singing at protests, but also with trying to do a little bit of organizing. And I'll be the first to admit that I'm no good at it and I have no experience at it, and it's very different from songwriting, but I'm trying to do some eviction resistance organizing in terms of the preparing for the wave of evictions that is going to be coming. And there's a lot of different groups doing this kind of organizing all over the place. And I love the way it's happening all over the place in decentralized ways. And I just thought, well, I'm just going to be part of that sort of effort to organize decentralized networks of eviction defense squads, because what seems to be clearly happening is they're all networked. The networks are networked, and when the shit hits the fan, everybody's going to be responding to the same evictions, regardless of which network they've organized themselves into. Kind of like with affinity groups or something.
So you're trying to, through your music, are you trying to inspire people to be more active? Are you trying to just put more activism issues out there?
Yeah, so I would say that basically the role that my music plays is very much the same kind of role that other music from this tradition plays, whether you're talking about Joe Hill or The Clash or Public Enemy. I mean, regardless, it's all basically topical music about current events in history, and it serves the purpose of popular education so that people can learn about things that they didn't know about before, or learn more about things that they didn't know so much about. But it also plays the, I think, really important role of reaching people on an emotional level, because music has that particular power, which has actually been proven by scientists. A few years ago, there was a study, and there's one of these things already knew and all the musicians already knew, but it was nice to have it proven that when you sing words, they go to the emotional centers of the brain. They get processed differently from when you speak words. And I think that's one of the many reasons why songs can be very powerful as a means of communicating a story, because you can communicate the emotion behind it in a way that is much more difficult to do without music. I think film can do that really well, but it's tricky to really sort of transport people to the place you're trying to bring them to, and music can do that. So, tool for popular education, a tool for taking people out of their own skin and putting them into somebody else's skin for a few minutes, and hopefully allowing them to have sometimes a transformational, profound experience, as they might have if they actually went somewhere, like traveled somewhere that they have never been to. That's the idea anyway. And I think it can work. So it serves different purposes, but it also very importantly serves the purpose of bringing community together, of fostering a sense of community, and sort of helping people to feel like they're part of something.
So, because of your nature and being very activism pro person, have you ever been to a specific strike where you heard Hill's music being played or sung?
A particular, yeah, I mean, but many. I mean, basically, I mean, it's just very common that at any kind of labor related event that at some point you're going to hear one of Joe Hill's songs. And it's even more likely that you're going to hear multiple songs by his contemporaries as well, because they all come together. You're going to hear somebody sing Preacher and the Slave by Joe Hill, and you're going to hear definitely somebody sing Solidarity Forever by Ralph Chaplin. You depending on how many wobbly geeks are around, then you might hear other songs like "There's Power in a Union," if you got especially any Billy Bragg fans, which is also another Joe Hill song that he was much more popularized by Billy Bragg than by Joe Hill himself. I think actually many more people know the song because of Billy Bragg. There's a lot of songs from that period, including Joe Hill songs, that you'll hear at any kind of gathering, of a labor related gathering, most in the US, if there's people who are sort of culturally oriented at all. I mean, the thing is that the labor movement by and large has it's nothing like what it used to be in the US. And of course, in other countries, it's a very thriving, vibrant, massive, central part of society. But in the US, it's so marginal at this point. And then a lot of the culture of the labor movement that has been exported around the world from the United States has not been passed down within the United States. So, you'll find like small gatherings of radicals like Wobblies and stuff. They'll be totally up on the music that's part of this cultural history, and political cultural history. But like if you're going to like a Labor Day picnic sponsored by a local AFL-CIO branch, it's still quite likely that somebody will be singing IWW songs at some point if anybody's doing live music, but it's not a guarantee. There's no guarantee about that by any means. Yeah. It's and it's often the case that if they have music, which they usually would, it's going to be like something completely apolitical, and maybe maybe whatever band they've got there has makes an effort to learn one union song for the occasion. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Some organizer will get up and sing Solidarity Forever at some point, even if the band isn't doing it. But and they may or may not ever know or say anything about the IWW or the association with the song and the union, and probably Joe Hill's name won't get mentioned. But even if one of his songs might get sung, I mean, it's a mishmash. It hasn't been these things have not been passed down in any kind of like systematic way at summer camp, at communist summer camp, the way they used to get passed down, the way they still do get passed down in like Sweden or Denmark, but in the US, we don't have that infrastructure anymore. There's only actually one communist summer camp left that I know of, and there used to be dozens, And I mean, now it sounds like a joke when I say communist summer camp, like, yeah, but that used to be a thing, I mean, the Communist Party had millions of members, and they put on camps in the summers for both for families and for children, and they they were all over the Catskills and Western Massachusetts and other parts of the country, including even Tennessee.
So, like you mentioned earlier, you play a lot in Europe and you're a traveling musician. And obviously Hill is gonna, and the IWW songs are gonna have an impact in Sweden. But have you noticed an impact of IWW songs anywhere else in Europe?
Yes, definitely. I mean, in Sweden, because Jo Emanuel Hägglund was from Sweden, and Gefle from north of Stockholm, beautiful little town, and his home where he grew up has been perfectly preserved. It's a wonderful museum and place to visit. He was one of 11 kids, so it's a, not a big house for 11 kid family, but it's a pretty nice big house to visit if anybody's ever in Gefle, in Sweden. But in the 60s, a lot of people were doing Joe Hill songs in Swedish in the folk revival, which was very much hand in hand in many countries, as with the U.S. It was a very political sort of musical revival in the 60s, and Joe Hill's songs got a new life in Sweden that they really hadn't had before the 60s. It was his music, I believe, as I understand it, was not especially well known in Sweden until the 60s, long after his death, when a lot of his songs were translated into Swedish, some of them very badly translated into Swedish. I toured a lot with a Swedish songwriter who was also a historian and really knowledgeable about Swedish labor history and Joe Hill, and he showed me some of these translations, and some of them are very bad, specifically Rebel Girl, because Rebel Girl, the term girl in English, as it was used at the time, meant woman. Or girl. It could be either one, but in the context of that song, clearly he meant woman, and as it would be translated in contemporary English, but in the Swedish, the term woman and girl was really two different terms, certainly by the 60s, as I understand it, and so they translated girl literally as girl. So in Swedish, it's young girl. So then to say the rebel young girl, it takes the whole meaning of the song. Like, how could they even have done that? I mean, it's obviously a song about a woman, but anyway. But then because the radical labor movement that Joe Hill was a part of from the early 20th century in the U.S. was hugely influential around the world. I mean, May Day in the 1880s, from the movement for the 8-hour day in the United States, when May 1st became International Workers' Day on May 1st, 1886. This was exported to the rest of the world. So the entire world still today celebrates May Day as International Workers' Day. It's just the only place they don't do that is the United States, pretty much. But and this was intentional. It was changed. It was moved to September so that we wouldn't be celebrating May Day on the same day as the Russians, But then but that whole May Day tradition and the whole tradition of the Wobblies captured the imagination of people around the world and had a tremendous influence on the global labor movement. So Joe Hill definitely, in waves throughout the 20th century, just as he continued to have an influence on the labor, on the cultural milieu within the United States, just as he was revived as a concept in the 60s by the Swedish songwriters and also by Joan Baez and so many others. And then just as his music was once again sort of revived in new ways in the 80s by Utah Phillips it's and then by the resurgence of the IWW since that time, not that it's anything like it was, but it's grown significantly compared to what it was in the 80s. And so all that has had repercussions around the world to one degree or another. So it's definitely, wherever you find radical labor people, you'll find one degree or another knowledge of Joe Hill, especially in English speaking countries or countries where English is a dominant second language, which is basically everywhere in Europe, but probably more in Northern Europe than in Southern Europe. If Joe Hill has made his way into the sort of cultural sort of imagination of places in Southern Europe, more likely he made his way there through like Latin America. But it's all, there's a lot of cross pollination, and there's also been, even in the days since Joe Hill, in the decades since Joe Hill, there's been a lot of cross pollination between the folk revival of the United States and the folk revival in Latin America. So like the Nuevo Canción movement that was and is a very big part of the sort of cultural milieu, or at least a certain significant segment of the population from Mexico to Argentina. That whole movement has been influenced by Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie very consciously, and vice versa. Pete Seeger and it was very consciously influenced by Nueva Canción, and there's lots of very open and not hidden cross pollination, and so Joe Hill would have worked his way into that as well, because of his dominance in the folk music scene in the United States. So there's all kinds of weird, ways that you find his influence all over the place in all kinds of ways where that in many cases people don't even realize that the influence is there, which is a wonderful thing, because actually, even as hard as it may be to research some of that influence, when you know that you see the influence in ways where people don't even know that the influence is there, it's a real, it's the kind of thing Joe Hill, I assume, would be very proud of as an artist, because it's just the sort of thing he was trying to do, to become part of the culture, not to be shining a light on himself. He was never trying to do that.
So have you ever been to Salt Lake City or Utah? And because that's where Hill was executed and he lived his last years, is his memory any different there than throughout the rest of the United States?
Yeah, it is, and certainly that became. I'm not sure how much that was true before 2015, but certainly in 2015, on the 100th anniversary of his execution, there were journalists like Jeremy Harmon was doing just fantastic stuff in the Salt Lake City Tribune, wonderful series of articles on the background of Joe Hill, really some of the best stuff out there, I think, anywhere outside of or within academia that you can find on Joe Hill is stuff that Jeremy Harmon has been doing for the Salt Lake Tribune. And really kind of interesting I don't know who owns the Salt Lake Tribune, but it was very interesting to see, like, at least when it comes to history, they were letting all kinds of great stuff, all kinds of radical perspective was in there. I think that's true with a lot of the press. Like, if you're doing an article about history, you can get stuff in there a lot more easily than if you're doing stuff about contemporary politics, which are much more controversial, But definitely in Salt Lake City, for those who are paying attention, which is, probably a small minority of the population, but bigger minority than most cities. They are, I'd say, for a lot of the people, they're still fighting the fight over, who killed that shopkeeper that Joe Hill was accused of killing, and who shot Joe Hill. And this is very much unfinished business for a lot of people in Salt Lake City.
So you've seen a lot of different movements throughout history, and in your opinion, as new generations start to protest and older generations start to stop the protest, have you seen that Hill's or the IWW's history, is it being dropped with the younger generations, or is it being renewed each generation?
It is. I mean, I guess I'd say it's a mix of things, but it keeps on getting renewed, not in any kind of like really. Well, okay, I'd say in some places it gets renewed in very systematic ways, and in other ways it gets renewed by freak accidents, which may not be such freak accidents. Maybe it's almost inevitable, but I'd say like in places like Denmark and Sweden, and I'm just mentioning places that I'm really familiar with, not because it's not happening elsewhere. It's just that those are places I can mention where there's a real sort of intentional passing on of this kind of culture, where kids go to summer camp run by left wingers, and they very intentionally are taught songs by Joe Hill and David Rovics, actually, and other songwriters. These kids grow up in Denmark, going to these camps, learning my songs, learning Joe Hill's songs. Then by the time they're teenagers, they're listening to me on Spotify, and they're and you can see it in the statistics. And so I know, and I can see that my audience remains young, and continues to be young, no matter how much I get older. And some of these things are really easy to see because you can see it in the statistics and that Spotify and YouTube is nice enough to provide us with, but so there is this like clear passing on of culture that happens but I think in some places where that's really intentional, also through good educational radio programming on state broadcasters in some European countries that do really good educational stuff on history. But it also gets passed down. The culture gets passed down by more sort of accidental ways. And I would say like one example of that is the tremendous influence that Billy Bragg has had on culture, both on both sides of the Atlantic. Just by doing songs about Joe Hill and songs by Joe Hill and songs about and by Woody Guthrie and that album Mermaid Avenue. I think it'd be hard to overstate what an impact he had on maintaining the knowledge and the music of Joe Hill into the current moment that we're in. I mean, by the same token, I'd say people like Utah Phillips and Ani DeFranco in the latter 20th century, very latter, last 20 years of the 20th century, had a tremendous impact on keeping alive the memory and the music. But these were all sort of maybe not inevitable that folks like Ani and Billy would play those roles, whereas when it's being passed on methodically at summer camp, it's kind of more that people are going to learn those songs. So either way, it works in these cases anyway.
Well, that was the last question I had for you. I just want to thank you again for just being so helpful and agreeing to do this interview and answering all the questions on email.
My pleasure, Gacko. My pleasure.
Thank you. You've been good help.
I'll just stop recording then.